Seeing quorum in the room. I would like to call this meeting to order and wish to acknowledge that our meeting is taking place on unceded Algonquin territory. I would like to thank the Algonquin Nation for hosting us on their land. Could I get a mover to approve this agenda? Trustee Blackburn, are there any changes required? I see none. I will call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. I would like to call upon the chair for their briefing. Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first item I wanted to note is a Health Canada memorandum with regard to garage sales. Spring is certainly a popular time for our school councils to be holding fundraising activities, and one activity that has attracted the attention of Health Canada from a safety perspective is garage sales. The Hazardous Products Act states that everyone holding a garage sale is legally responsible for ensuring that products sold, whether new or used, are safe and meet current safety standards. Products intended for use by children, which often show up at school garage sales. For example, baby gates, walkers, car seats, cribs, playpens, toys that might present choking hazards, and helmets. Any of those things must meet the requirements of the Hazardous Products Act. So I hope that our school councils are aware, and that our parent community is aware in general that there are risks attached to bringing these things in for sale. The second item I'd like to note is that we do have our student recognition evening coming up on the 30th of May, and that's our celebration of student leadership throughout the year. I hope that all of my colleagues will be able to attend that, and I hope that people are also planning to attend some of the other celebrations and recognition evenings that we hold between now and the end of the school year. For example, on the 13th of June, we have our volunteer appreciation evening, and we also will have our board-wide retirement reception coming up later in June as well. So please try to plan that in. I know it's a busy schedule, but it's important to be there if you can. Thank you.
Are there any questions from trustees? I would like to call upon the director for their briefing.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. First item is the OCDSB students who won awards at the French public speaking competition recently. Over 300 students in grades 4 through 12 from across the province participated in the annual provincial French speaking event earlier this month. Students in grades 4 to 8 participated in a non-competitive festival showcasing their French language and public speaking skills, while students in grades 9 to 12 participated in a competitive concours for cash prizes and partial scholarships to York University's Glendon campus, as well as the University of Ottawa. I am very proud to announce that 4 OCDSB students were winners. Congratulations to Yai-Fei Tao and Catherine Tao from Colonel Bai Secondary School, Reina Barrera from Canterbury High School, and Asser Abdel Jawad from Lisker Collegiate Institute. So congratulations to those students. Second item is Colonel Bai Secondary School student winning a National Science Fair. Bhavya Nohan, a student at Colonel Bai Secondary School, has won Best Project Award at this year's Canada-wide Science Fair. Bavia came first out of 464 other projects for his work on immunotherapy, which is a type of cancer treatment that helps the immune system fight cancer cells. He will now head to the European Union contest for young scientists in Bulgaria in September. Congratulations to Bavia on his outstanding achievement. And finally, commentary on our Date with Diversity event held last week at Canterbury High School, held on Tuesday, May the 14th. The human library format engaged staff, students, and trustees in explorations of the impact of identity on the real life realities of many of our community members. The narratives were shared and illuminated the intersectional nature of diversity, and gave many of the participants much to consider in our daily interactions in schools and in the community. And that is all for my report, Madam Chair.
Are there any questions from trustees? I see none. There are no delegations this evening, so we're moving forward to matters of action. We have before us a notice of motion, re-English program by Trustee Campbell. Trustee Campbell, would you like an introduction?
Thank you very much. I won't read the whereas. Hopefully people have had a chance to go through them. I want to concentrate, I want to extract some highlights for me. The whereas, of course, contain my rationale and my motivation. Colleagues may or may not share the full set of concerns that I do, but it's certainly what is motivating me to put forward this motion. The motion effectively is an information request. No decisions are associated apart from asking for the information. And effectively, if this were passed, a report would come forward in the fall, presumably for trustee discussion. And at that point, people could decide next steps, if any, things could die there, what have you. So I guess why this, why now is sort of one of the key questions. And trustee colleagues may recall that I think a few weeks back sent around some stats on the dip in early primary English registration year over year, which I thought was quite exceptional. I believe, without, I can't prove causation, but it's likely related to the 50-50 JK-SK change that the board brought in recently. And so I am concerned about the potential for accelerated reduction in English language program. As well, I know that the board is engaged in a series of accommodation reviews over time, not all at once, sort of biting off chunks of the district and rationalizing them as sort of as we go. So there was sort of a near West review recently, which people will remember with fondness, I'm sure. And there'll be other sections of the district which I believe or understand, which will basically be reviewed with more or less the same lens, and so we will go across the district rationalizing. Right now, we're under a de facto provincial moratorium, so gathering information about maybe want to change something as we go forward across the district, this is a good time to do it, because it's very difficult to re-examine what you're doing once you're too far down the pipe in terms of sort of restructuring the district from an accommodation perspective. So this really is sort of accommodation focused, and folks will notice that I'm talking about program co-location and what that may mean, etc. But it comes from two basic concerns. One, that we have important social sorting going on, which to me is anathema for public education. And two, that we may have important inefficiencies or problems or non-optimization in terms of how we're structuring our schools and our programs. The rest, I think, is pretty much in the whereas. I would like to thank all those who helped contribute to the motion. The version before you has gone through several drafts. And I'll happy to take questions or may join in debate later. Thank you.
Okay, I've started a speakers list. Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Trustee Campbell, for bringing this forward. Clearly, we have some issues with our English program that need to be looked at and dealt with, and I do concur with his analysis that this would be a good time since the province has continued the moratorium on our accommodation reviews, and there doesn't seem to be an indication of when that will be lifted. I would like a staff comment on how they feel about whether this all the asks in this are doable, and I would assume early fall means September, October, and from a staff perspective, is that doable? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. The discussion, there has been, of course, a great deal of discussion around this particular motion, and certainly there is an awareness on the part of staff that it is not only a program matter, but an operational matter that needs exploration. So indeed, we've already begun some of the structures to begin doing this work. We do recognize that the second part of the work will certainly fall out of the first part, and so we appreciate the opportunity to have a timeline that will allow us to bring a robust structure for trustees to discuss prior to anticipating steps or action items. So I do believe that it is reasonable to start with the structural piece at this point.
Trustee Boothby.
Just
Nope.
a follow-up, Madam Chair? So through you, Madam Chair, to the director or to staff, so is September, October, is that a reasonable timeline?
I think we discussed October.
That's all for now. Thank you.
I do have an indication that our CFO does have commentary.
Well, I think, Madam Chair, we had sort of looked at this towards the end of October. There's some of the work is done and some will be in progress over the summer, but when I think of early fall, I always think of before Halloween. But we'll see. That it's always a balance between getting everything and getting it done quickly. So we'll take a look at the way the work goes, and we might find that in order to hit the end of October, that there's some pieces that we're using proxies for or other pieces of it. But we did have these discussions with the trustee earlier, and we think it's reasonable to aim for that.
Trustee Boothby.
Thank you, and thank you to Trustee Campbell for bringing this up. We've been kind of talking around this for a number of years, and so I'm really glad to see this all put together in this one cohesive asking so that we can really look at what's going on in our English programs. I just have a couple of questions to the trustee. In Part A, 2i, what do you mean by disaggregated by program for high school? I guess the reason I ask the question is that we know a couple of years ago we made all high schools effectively dual track, English and French immersion. So I'm wondering if that's the program that you're talking about, or is it something deeper?
Trustee Campbell.
Thank you. My intention was more not in terms of the language of a program, but more sort of getting at academic versus applied. And I think that's I hope at least that was the understanding had in the discussions with staff.
Okay, thank you for that. And I guess the other question that I had is in Part A, we're talking about current and projected enrollment. So are we just sort of looking for 2 data points here, or were we looking for a couple of years on the preceding, what would be 2018-19?
Trustee Campbell?
Thank you. It's really, I think, up to staff to discretion. My concern was I think we need to know, generally speaking, where we stand, but then also given trend lines to the extent that we can sort of speculate, or to the extent that staff can speculate based on their available data. What are the trends, and where do we expect things may be moving in the future? That's what I was trying to get at. But in terms of the actual details, in terms of how the numbers are crunched and the tables that come forward and all that, I leave that to staff. So.
Okay, excellent. And that's what I was hoping for, is we were going to look at what the trend is over a couple of years. I mean, I don't want to make this a 6-month, hundreds and hundreds of hours project, but I think it'll be very useful to see what the trend has been in this district. So I'll be happy to support this motion. Thank you.
Trustee Penny?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is very good. This is a very interesting study. I can see that it's going to be very helpful. But I see that we're really just compiling enrollment statistics, which in itself is interesting, but unfortunately I don't think it's going to get into the underlying reasons why these sorts of things are happening, and hence I take it that that is why we have Part B. And I think it's good, but also I think the story behind this data is not necessarily, unfortunately, staff related, but it's going to perhaps involve asking members of the community about their feelings about why they chose this path. So I'm wondering if there's that element in this, if you foresaw that we would have to do some of that sort of work, that sort of qualitative type of study, so that we could come up with phenomena or any sort of trend that way.
Trustee Campbell?
Potentially, yes, but I didn't want to speculate in terms of either the interest of the board or where a discussion may or may not go in the fall once we get sort of some basic facts on the table. Maybe at that point, folks will want to do further study in some regard, maybe qualitative, maybe quantitative, maybe research will be requested, maybe this, maybe that, maybe, I don't speculate. I really wanted to make sure that we had the discussion, but I at least felt that I would be unable to participate well in the discussion without some of this basic information before me anyway. And I offer the suggestion that's be the case for others as well. The Part B, the trustee is quite correct, is meant to highlight what might be a concern with respect to this or that. I don't want to, again, prefigure or bias things too much, but what might emerge from the data. I don't know that trustees around the table necessarily want to have a big package with delivered on their desk with a thump, which is just data tables. So I'm looking for sort of a light analytic gloss from staff, but in a very light way. And staff also may not have the analytic cycles. And in spite of my whereas, which are decidedly one-sided in terms of my set of concerns, and I think that's clear to everybody, the motion itself doesn't make assumptions necessarily about how this may go. So, for instance, it tries to ask effectively a couple of questions. Do we have significant social sorting? And potentially, if we do, is that a bad thing? I mean, I'm open to maybe homogenous school populations are good for some reason. Again, I'm really concerned about social sorting in a public board of education, and where I'm coming from on this is really clear. But there may be pluses and minuses. I'm not suggesting that even if there is significant social sorting, which remains to be determined, that it would necessarily all be negative in every case. So that's what I'm sort of hoping that comes out in the B, sort of a listing of possible concerns. And if people were concerned about something, then what could potentially be done to address it? The plus, the 50-50 JK-SK experiment seems to have gone extremely well, I will suggest. At least I don't hear anything negative about it. Maybe there is. I think that we should be perhaps open-minded with respect to the solutions, the big solutions that we potentially consider in the fall. No disrespect to the importance of branding, but I'm not sure that branding exercises or similar tweaks will necessarily address what I am concerned may be the problem. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I just have one follow-up, and I do have a slight question with regards to Part B2, and that appears to me that we are talking about solutions before we've done any analysis. So I'm wondering if the motion might foresee a small pause once parts A, 1, and 2 and Part B1 are completed, so that trustees may consider in a thoughtful way before we get into programming accommodations, policies, resourcing, strategic changes, which would significantly address any concerns. I'm just throwing it out there. It might be a good idea. It might be an idea to reduce the amount of work that staff has to do, so that we don't go down any blind box canyons.
My idea in B2 was not to have analysis, really just, in fact, some of my original wording was a menu, a menu list, like an inventory of ideas more than anything, so really not offering solutions. But again, this motion is really aimed at really fully supporting a rich discussion to be had later. So rather than people maybe coming up, like basically, let's get all the basic ideas out there. They may even be mutually contradictory. But in a sense, the B is about it's about fertilizing the discussion, and that's really the B too. I wasn't expecting a lot of analysis from staff on that.
Trustee Penny, did you want your question to go to staff?
Yeah, actually, that'd probably be a good idea. I just, if you had a response to that, like Part B2 does, it is rather broad in its statement, and I can see that, anything to do with parents in our community is not a simple on-off switch, as we have come to discover. There is very complex underpinnings in our society here in Ottawa, the way it works, why people make decisions, and I can see that we could actually spend quite a bit of time trying to do number B2 and even B1. So I'm just wondering what your response might be.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair, indeed, the Part A of the motion certainly lends itself to a very robust conversation in and of itself, and I would caution the notion of a speculative conversation based on that information at that particular time when we first raise it, because we do know that sometimes suggestions may be taken as something other than suggestions in this particular forum. So the staff certainly has discussed the motion, and while it is, we understand the desire to have factual information, we do have a reluctance around going down the road of speculation without the discussion having first occurred.
Trustee Ellis?
Thank you. A couple of times now, the JK SK 50/50 has been referenced in this discussion. One of the assertions when we spoke and made those changes from district staff was that we would find more equitable uptake of EFI from newcomers, but other families and parents who having gone through the 50/50 kindergarten process might be more comfortable in taking up early French immersion. Now, I had assumed that when we got the report, the update on how the that 50/50 JKSK came back, that would be one of the components that would be looked at. I'm just wondering if, from staff, whether that would be that kind of analysis of the impact on those groups will come during the 50/50 SKJK report, or might that or be included in this English programming ask?
Through you, Chair, I would ask perhaps Manager Ostapchuk to respond.
Thank you, Madam Chair, through you. Certainly, we're going to do everything that we can to offer the information needed to have a really good look at English. When it comes to the 50/50, quite frankly, from a planning perspective, we haven't got a track record long enough. We can tell you what has happened over the past couple of years, but that isn't something that we think is good enough as in terms of time to be truly reflective of what the impact of that 50/50 is, but we can begin to try and tell that story. It's certainly not a long period of time, though.
That's true, but I was wondering, might we see, one of the things that we have is if your designated school is an English language school, sorry, I'm banging the table, English language school, but if if the parent knows that they wish their child to be in the early French immersion program, we allow them to start JKSK. So I'm just wondering, if we see, it would be interesting for me, and might go to, Trustee Campbell mentioned anecdotally, it looks like there's been more of that way. So how many are asking for that request, and then of course, having finished JKSK at an English school, how many are requesting to go to the go into the EFI, and conversely, how many who have started at a French immersion center then choose a English program to go to, because I think this may impact choices. We know that there's a hesitancy from parents to disrupt their, especially young children, by going to a new school. So, that's the kind of thing I think it has impact on the English, but I would also like to confirm that the assertion that JK SK 50/50 actually does help us in an equitable way of bringing everyone in to consider EFI. And thank you, Chair.
Trustee Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As others have said, I welcome this motion, because when we look at the enrollment reports each year over the last good number of years, we've seen the decline in the enrollment in the English program and the increase in the enrollment in the early French immersion program in particular, year after year. And whenever we look at accommodation reviews or boundary studies, we see also the impact on schools of having very small enrollments in the English program, and the disruption that can sometimes come about when we find we really have to change things in order to have viable programs in our schools. I think that Part A certainly is a very important one. And one thing I would like clarified through you to staff is would Part A mean as well that we would be getting some information on cohort size per grade on a school-by-school basis so we could understand the implications of those small numbers?
Madam Chair, through you, I think we can confirm to you that that would be information that we would be trying to provide. A question was raised earlier about how far back we'd be looking, 15 years. How far forward would we look? Well, probably that same number, but as I say often enough, projections get a little fuzzy the further you get out. Certainly, we'd be looking to provide you with what we hope is value sort of added information, like not only cohort size, but whether the school is an urban school, a suburban school, or a rural school. We think that's germane. So there would be a number of different facets that we hope would be of good information to trustees as they examine this issue.
Thank you for that response. When I look at Part B, I understand that nobody really wants to speculate and go out guessing, particularly if things that are thoughts might be construed as intentions. But I think one of the other things we also probably need to have a look at is what our policy decisions have been over the last number of years that have possibly impacted how our schools operate in terms of their program offerings. We did have the expansion of the Middle French immersion that certainly introduced some changes. We have done accommodation reviews, which have introduced some changes, and we have also made our shift to the 50-50 program at the kindergarten level, which has introduced probably some changes. But we don't know whether any particular change is entirely attributable to any one of those policy decisions. However, at the same time, I think it's important to be mindful of the policy decisions that we have made in the past and so that we can remind ourselves of the expectations we had when we made them. I think that one of the really important pieces here is to understand, is there a problem? What's the shape of the problem? And how big a problem is it? And after that, then we can go out and talk to people and look at the problem in much more detail, and that's when we really start beginning to look for possible solutions. But you can't go looking for solutions until you know what the problem is, and I think this motion will help us to understand that. Thank you.
Our representative from F-Cadet-Tow, Mr. Lesage.
Thank you, Chair. Brian Lesage, elementary teachers. Having taught in the system over a long period of time and having seen the profound changes in our board that this motion, I think, is trying to shed a light on, I agree wholeheartedly that it's important data to get. Having started teaching exclusively in English and then inevitably having to teach less and less English and teaching almost exclusively immersion, these are profound changes, and I think getting to the root of the data of that is important. I would request through you, Chair, to either the mover or perhaps to staff, if we are going to get to the goals of Section B, to identify key operational or pedagogical impacts, what are the mechanisms that we might put in place to speak to teachers who would have a lot to say about the operational and pedagogical components of this change? I think if we are going to get the qualitative picture that we need, I would suggest, with respect, that teacher voice is something that we're going to have to listen to and hear. And I wonder what might be done under this motion to consult with your educators to get that qualitative piece. Thank you.
Trustee Campbell?
Oh.
Thank you. I make no assumptions, actually. I'd love, because I love data and I love ideas, and I think we all do, I'd love to see all of this come forward in great richness, ideally. But I also make no assumptions about what's doable. I am looking for something that's relatively doable over the summer, early fall, and we can prime a really rich discussion in the fall, and then see where we go from there. Maybe further consultations required at that point. I make no assumptions about what can actually be delivered. The report that comes forward, I'm thoroughly prepared, at least from staff, may say, could not, whatever, if that's the case. So if they can't bring forward credible suggestions that they can stand behind around pedagogy or other matters, so be it, and then that might become a research item or a consultation item as a result of further discussion in the fall. Again, I make no assumptions.
I don't have any other speakers on my list. Trustee Campbell, would you like a wrap-up then?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ideally, folks would support all aspects of this motion. A1 is aimed at sorting. A2 is aimed at structure, though they integrate to a certain extent. B is aimed at providing effectively gloss on what otherwise will be a lot of data tables for people to look at, and really just sort of to call out in B1 what are key observations to help prime the discussion pump, and do staff think that there's an issue or a concern with respect to some of these observations or not. In B2, you know, if people considered something to be a concern, let's say social sorting, then what are the 6 big ideas that might be used to address? Some may be thoroughly impractical, either financially, in terms of our ability to control as a board, or politically. And there could be other issues that could be concerned about accommodation sufficiency, what have you. Other things may arise out of this report. So B2, again, was sort of aimed at, again, sort of a list of ideas in terms of identifying from a staff perspective what might be a concern, and what are the big ideas, what's the raft of ideas that might be applied. Again, really just to prime the pump. I don't want to put staff on the spot. This really is about fertilizing the discussion amongst colleagues at the board. That's the intent.
So I will call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. So next on our agenda, we have the report from statutory and other committees. 7.1, we have the report from the Parent Involvement Committee of April 17th, 2019. Trustee Blackburn. Are there any errors or omissions? I see none. I would like to call the vote on receipt. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. So we have the report from the Advisory Committee on Equity, April 25th, 2019. Trustee Campbell, would you like to move receipt of the report? Are there any errors or omissions? Trustee Ellis?
Yes, when we updated the terms of reference for the Advisory Committee on Equity, we made it that there are 2 trustees assigned to that committee. I was Trustee Campbell and myself were the 2, but I'm listed as under staff and guests. I should be listed under non-voting members. Thank you.
All those in favor of receipt? Opposed? It's carried. Are there any questions? So we move now to matters for discussion. 8.1, we have report 19-062, student suspension report for the 2017-2018 school year. I would like to call upon the director to introduce the report.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair, I'd like to pass this report to Associate Director Reynolds, who will introduce staff and take us through the report and the presentation that is attached.
Great, and thank you, and through you, Madam Chair, I have with me Assistant Principal of Safe Schools Colin Anderson and Manager Reed, Jonah Orchesky, to help with the presentation and answer questions when we get to that portion. So you have before you the letter of transmittal and accompanying report on suspension data for the 2017-2018 school year, so not this current school year, but the previous one. On the screen, you'll see a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation, not so much reviewing what's contained in the report, but providing a little bit of further context to support the conversation, the discussion that might follow, and perhaps answer some other questions that you may have. So as you may know, principals have responsibility under the Education Act as well as policy and procedure to consider suspension when some certain behaviors, certain infractions they believe have occurred, and it is a must-consider requirement. For example, if a student were to engage in activity that a principal deemed possibly injurious to the physical or mental well-being of others in the school, the principal must consider suspension. But there's a number of other factors and things to take into consideration before they'd actually go about imposing a suspension, such as the age of the student, the severity of the infraction of the behavior, the impact on school climate, as well as whether or not the student has an exceptionality or an IEP, they understand the consequences of their action, how suspension may help them further learn and modify, regulate their own behaviors. You can see when student behaviors take place that result in suspension, the goal of the suspension is correction, redirection, and education. So we operate under a framework of progressive discipline. Discipline is to be both corrective and supportive. It's not intended to be purely punitive. Suspensions are intended to help students and their families, their guardians, understand the standards of behavior in our schools and to promote safe and caring classroom and learning environments. Also, just so you're aware, all suspensions have to be between 1 school day and 20 school days. 20 school days is the maximum. All are subject to appeal, and when families and students are made aware of the suspension, they're made aware of that process as well. But of course, what we really hope to achieve is changes and supports in our learning environments that reduce or lead to a reduction in the types of behaviors or incidents that could possibly lead to suspension. And to that, we undertake a number of proactive measures. There's a lot of informal coaching and mentoring of new teachers and classroom teachers, peer-to-peer, administration-to-peer, to help increase their toolkit, their strategies for working successfully with students. But we also have a number of formal interventions and programs in place as well. In recent years, we've undertaken a great deal of training for our staff and behavior modification systems, or BMS. Restorative practices has had a large presence in the district over the past number of years, with a number of our teachers, in particular administrators, trained in it, not only as a possible alternative to suspension, but also as a way to help restore damaged relationships and promote a successful return to school for students who have received a suspension, which is ultimately the goal, to see once the behavior has been addressed and corrected, that the students are able to return to the learning environment, and that the behavior has been addressed and the student is welcome back. CPS, collaborative problem solving, is another, all of our principals and vice principals have received training in that over the past few years, and it's approach and working collaboratively with students to help address underlying issues that may have led to the behavior in the first place. We always use or encourage the use of our multi-D teams, the staff that we have in our schools, guidance teams, student success teachers, LSTs, to further support students in addressing some of the factors that might lead to the dysregulation of the behavior. We use IEAs, itinerant educational assistants, who are experts in supporting staff and helping kids manage and learn regulation skills. Safe and accepting school teams, bullying prevention, intervention planning, school climate surveys have been around for a number of years and help inform our practices in schools, as well as evidence-based student programs. We've really encouraged over the last number of years moving towards, wherever possible, evidence-based programs such as WITS and LEADS, which has been instrumental in supporting our bullying prevention intervention plans. The fourth R, which is a primarily secondary program to help with harm reduction and risk reduction. And Link Crew, as you know, is a successful program to encourage promote an effective transition into secondary school. When we alleviate some of those underlying stressors and concerns, the hope being that behaviors are further reduced. So I'm going to turn things over to Assistant Principal Anderson to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing in the data.
So the trends in the data reference the appendix that you have as part of the letter of transmittal. Key items, clearly we continue to see an increase at a rate faster than that of enrollment of behaviors that result in the application of a suspension. This is particularly the case at an elementary level. And this increase may be consistent with the increase in the reporting of dysregulated and often aggressive behaviors by students in the younger grades. Boys continue to be suspended at a greater rate than girls across all of our areas, and that may be attributed to the fact that boys are more likely to communicate their dysregulation through physical modes, and we're more likely to apply a suspension for physical behavior because of the safety impact. Likewise, students identified with a behavioral exceptionality are suspended at the highest rate of any individual group, which in some ways is likely linked to the their behaviors in the schools. The good news piece, the majority, approximately 2/3 of our students that are suspended for 1 day only and only once in a school year, which is evidence, we hope, that for most students that the correction, redirection, and education, that's the intent of the suspension process, is effective. In your folio on folio 28, which is table 3 from Appendix A, we have an introduction of a disproportionality index. This is new to how we're reporting suspension data. And so we felt like some discussion around that particular table and index was of value. This table helps show how students in multiple identified groups are impacted. And our intent with this table is to investigate a method that may be helpful when identity-based data reporting becomes part of our suspension data. What this table helped us see was some of the combinations of factors and their impacts, particularly when we're looking at students living in communities with low socioeconomic status and their circumstances showing a disproportionate number of suspensions. In fact, as we look at totals, our students living in low SES circumstances represent a little over a quarter of our student population, but nearly half of all students who are suspended.
So going forward, we'll continue to monitor and report out on the data of students receiving suspension. We'll continue to provide updated training to principals, vice principals, and other key staff. I know all of our departments who work in supporting students are constantly trying to come up with new ways to support students, not only in terms of self-regulation, but also in terms of providing engaging, meaningful, and impactful learning opportunities, which with greater engagement, often we hope to see decreased dysregulated behavior. So curriculum services and learning support services are key partners in the work that they're doing to help bring about positive and safe learning environments. And of course, we have an opportunity going forward as we begin to collect identity-based data for our students to increasing our understanding of some of the challenges that our students face that can lead to those dysregulated behaviors and how we may best support them in addressing that. So with that, you've had opportunity to read through the report and information, and we welcome any questions that you may have.
Trustee Fisher?
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. As always, it was an interesting read over the weekend. I guess I had a couple comments, reflections, and then perhaps a question in terms of next steps, because I know that that's part of the purpose of tonight's discussion. You know, I think when I look at the data and the report itself, there was a comment in the report that the material provided didn't include exclusions. And I thought that that was a really interesting decision in many respects. And I'm wondering if we were to include exclusions, how that may change some of the trends that we're seeing, you know, within our classrooms. Because I was also struck by the comment that majority of students are suspended for one day and only once in a school year. And so when I take that and I take students who may be removed from school or classroom because of exclusions, you know, it raises a really interesting question for me in terms of, are we capturing the fullness of the potential challenge that we face? So can you talk a little bit more about the exclusions, and then I have some follow-ups.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. So the decision not to include exclusions in this report was deliberate. Exclusions expressly are not to be disciplinary in nature. And so really trying to make that distinction between suspension, which is discipline, and exclusion, which is more of a safe schools measure. We have had for a number of years in our district, subject to just what is in the Ed Act 265 N1 that outlines the duty of a principal to exclude someone from the learning area if they feel that their presence may pose a safety hazard to other pupils. So we've sent direction to our principals, which we've been continuing to educate them with around the purpose of exclusions is when we don't have other options in the short term to ensure safety. Typically an incident has happened, the student may not fully be able to control or understand the impact of their behavior, so disciplining them wouldn't be appropriate, but we simply need time typically to come up with a plan or change circumstances in order to make things more safe back in the classroom. So when that happens, the parents or guardians, if the student is under 18, but typically in all cases a parent or guardian, receives written notification outlining the reason for the exclusion, the steps that the school intends to take in cooperation with the family to end the exclusion or change circumstances so that they will be safer, and that they have a right to appeal that. We do track it, but our capacity with our staff using Trillium as it is something we continue to work on to track that data accurately. Right now, I can't say that we have accurate data within Trillium in terms of student exclusion, but principals do have an accurate tracking of who's been excluded and for how many days. Typically, I think when we have reviewed the data, exclusions are often short-term, a couple of days, but there have been instances where they have gone longer when trying to serve and support more complex needs.
Okay, I think that's helpful. I'd like to see the two side by side. I know that they're, at the end of the day, it's suspension and exclusions, but they all have an impact potentially in terms of the learning environment in the classroom. So for me, I see potentially our approach in terms of tackling the broadness of these issues, whether in terms of behavior in the classroom, are connected. Even though I know that they're, from a definition standpoint and from a statutory standpoint, they're separate. I guess to close, one of the things that also struck me in this report, and I've seen this in the last couple of years now, is our ability to really identify and focus on some key problems. And the presentation identified one where you said, while approximately 1/4 of our students live in lower income neighborhoods, these students account for nearly half of all students suspended. I guess the question that I would have for you is, much like the report that's to come next on Indigenous students, is it possible to put in place, an action plan, a strategy now that at least starts to look at the things that we know, right? Because the numbers are great. We can see the trends, but I also see some clear areas where we could be putting some focus. So is there an intent from staff to then come back to trustees to say, of the things that we know, here's an action plan in terms of how we can start really addressing these, potentially within the board or potentially with other partners, because we're certainly not going to be able to address all the things that are happening in lower income neighborhoods. But I think that's clear direction for me in terms of where we could be putting our focus. So what's the action plan? What's the next step?
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair, and the Director may wish to add on to my comments. So there are a number of steps being taken currently. I don't want to suggest that we're waiting. We, for example, things such as social emotional learning teachers are dispatched to areas of higher need, and if those resources are where we have higher instances of student behavior, then that's where we tend to put in those resources. So that's just one example of things that we are already doing, and they are targeted. They're not equally distributed to all schools. They are sent to areas where students seem to be struggling with dysregulated behavior, whether they be from low SES or not, but given the rate of disproportionality, they likely are. But I know as our new strat plan is finalized and rolled out, there is an opportunity there to put further thought towards how we may support our students who are living under low SES.
Through you, Madam Chair, and just in addition, I certainly concur with the comments made by the Associate Director. This is an area where we have already started discussion around an action plan and looking at various ways that we address the impact of poverty in the realities that some of our communities experience. So it's not just a question of, while it does include matters of inclusion or exclusion based on whether it is dysregulation or behavior matters, we also consider programming matters, achievement matters, engagement matters as we look at this. So we're looking at a very holistic approach to how it is that we would address that when we look at an action plan under our strategic planning format.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to going deeper on this this particular topic.
Trustee Campbell?
Thank you, and thank you to Trustee Fisher, who took a couple questions right out of my mouth. In terms of the next steps, I very much appreciate the staff word on that, because the next steps on page 33 in Appendix A really had next steps being more data collection, and I would want to move more towards direct action to the extent possible. But so I very much appreciate the staff reply around that. One question that hasn't been asked yet, but I was very curious, and staff may not know or have a founded opinion on this, but there was an uptick effectively in suspensions over the 16-17 to 17-18, pretty much across the categories. And it does note in the report that I guess PD around progressive discipline was done during that year. So I guess one of my questions is, do we know, we may not be able to break it out, but were we actually presented in terms of the year-over-year difference with more incidents worthy of progressive discipline, or were staff effectively more consistent in proper application of the progressive discipline procedures which they're meant to follow, or both, or something else? Do we know effectively, is the uptick in a sense artificial, or was there higher incidence of disciplinable actions?
Through you, Madam Chair. The answer would be speculative. We did do training last year, throughout the year, in addressing dysregulated behavior in response to increased reporting of dysregulated behaviors through other things such as our violence in the workplace forums, concerns we'd heard from our teacher colleagues, things of that nature. So whether the training in and of itself led to an increase of application of suspension, we don't have an independent necessarily a way at the system level of collecting incident versus suspension, where an incident occurred for which there wasn't a suspension. That data is tracked at the school level, and not necessarily every incident that may lead to suspension would result in, say, another reporting such as the 733. I think we'll have to monitor over time. We do tend to look at things through a 3-year or 5-year rolling average and see, but certainly at mirror some of the comments that were made earlier, we did see an increase in other reporting of violent, using the title from the form, and dysregulated behavior over last year. So the increase in rate of suspension is not incongruent with that.
Great, thank you, and we'll see how this goes in future years. Maybe a pattern or merge, or things will settle out, and I guess we'll see. One final comment, and to Trustee Fisher again, I'll take this opportunity to provide my colleagues with a notice of motion to develop a policy and monitoring regimen for student exclusions, which I gather will be coming forward, if not this year, then maybe in the fall.
Trustee Ellis?
Thank you. I'd like to explore mitigating factors when it comes to suspensions. First, I guess I'd like to know, do we track a suspension that has been decided not to go forward because of a mitigating factor?
So through you, Madam Chair, not at the system level would we track an incident that occurred that did not result in a suspension, nor would we know if a suspension, say the incident may warrant a 3-day suspension, but given the mitigating factors, only a 1-day was applied. Many of the schools do track, they have, say, school incident reporting forms and are aware of incidents, and so you'd have an idea of what incidents have been reported compared to which ones led to suspension. I know there's an appendix in a revised safe school procedure coming forward that helps, again, remind principals and vice principals in the application of the procedure of the importance of considering the mitigating and other factors in determining suspension or length of suspension, but we can't provide you with that kind of clear comparative information.
Thank you. I do find the Disproportionality Index for identified groups very helpful, and has brought some of these questions to mind because it does highlight some of them. A number of years ago, we changed how we did special education, where it used to be the vast majority of students in the special education cohort had an IPRC. We then switched to not identifying so much and just going with an IEP and trying to get those students there. So I'm wondering, since, and it's a question around mitigating factors, does the mitigating factor that's outlined in the special education legislation and our policy only, does a student need an IPRC so that it kicks in some of these mitigating factors, or does it also, if the student just has an IEP, would there be mitigating factors that would come into play automatically when looking at suspensions?
Thank you for that, through you, Madam Chair. It should not depend on the presence of an identified exceptionality. An IEP should suffice. The idea is to take a look at the entire student in determining the best corrective and supportive action going forward. In theory, if a principal, not even in theory, hopefully in practicality, if a principal had a student before them who had committed an infraction for which a suspension was worthy and may not yet have an IEP even, let alone an IPRC, but there's an understanding that the student is not fully in control of their ability to regulate or does not understand the consequences, and those mitigating or other factors should apply. It's easier, perhaps, when there is an IEP that identifies that to help guide the principal, but good practice is going through the OSR and looking at the data that we have on the student in making those decisions around applying discipline.
From, I haven't crunched the numbers this year, but usually I put them together and see what the difference is between those in special education minus gifted and not, and usually, and as it shows on the Disproportionality Index, they are suspended at a higher rate. And I'm particularly, although they're small numbers, but the behavioral IPRC, it's concerning. It still is, going back to 2014, it's been pretty much been up and down a bit, but it still has some of the highest levels of suspension, and certainly that exceptionality, one would expect, would have some mitigating factors in it. So I'm just trying to, the reason I'm asking this, and I realize we can't give it, we don't have the data, but I think it's something that I would like to keep in our minds as we go forward to make sure that we are implementing the mitigating factors as they are intended to be. Thank you. That's all, Chair.
So I still have on my speakers list Trustee Boothby, Ms. Bailey, Trustee Penny, Trustee Scott. So Trustee Boothby, go ahead.
Thank you, and I'll take off on where Trustee Ellis was going there, and I thought he was going to ask my question, but with our trend of doing more IEPs and less IPRCs, one of my concerns is we're starting to lose trend lines, because on Folio 29 we have it broken out into exceptionalities, but we don't know what those exceptionalities are going forward if we're only IEPing children. So that's a concern of mine. Also, I'll ask an opinion on Folio 29 in the top paragraph. We talk about higher rates of suspension were observed for students with language impairments, students receiving special education support who have not been formally identified with an exceptionality, IEP'd only. My question would be, are we having better strategies around children and therefore potentially having less suspensions if their special education need were actually being identified with an IPRC?
Perhaps I could ask Superintendent Simmons to help, because I think the question really is, does an IPRC lead to greater supports which may reduce instances of behavior which might result in suspension?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, an IPRC would not lead to any greater supports. An IPRC would result in the development of an IEP or require the development of an IEP. But in many situations with our students who have an IEP only, already have an IEP that's been developed and providing the correct level of supports. With respect to the the statement in that paragraph, I think it would be a really large stretch for us to form a real opinion on the why because of that. Certainly, we know that the better job we do in meeting a child's special education needs, the better that they will do in all areas, behavior included.
Okay, and how do we continue to look at, because if we're IPR seeing less children, but we're actually seeing in some of these exceptionalities the trends going up, that's of concern if we see that we're IPR seeing less children. So any comments on that?
Madam Chair, I think I can appreciate where the question's coming from in terms of trying to link the discipline to the exceptionality. But I think another way to consider looking at it is in terms of what are we doing overall to help meet the behavioral needs of all of our students. And that includes things, as Associate Director Reynolds mentioned, things like our BMS training, which focuses on de-escalation strategies primarily, making sure that our programming is in place to help meet their academic needs. Those kinds of things are in place regardless of the exceptionality. One of the pieces that isn't captured, though, is what were the mitigating circumstances that led, or sorry, what were the progressive discipline steps that have led up to the suspension? So when we look at these numbers, we have to understand that principals take a look at these situations on an individual basis and may have made several decisions leading up before getting to the suspension where a student without special education needs may have progressed at a different rate along progressive discipline steps. But I do want to put an asterisk beside that comment because I don't want to leave the impression that progressive discipline is strictly a linear pattern, A, B, C, then suspension, because it is individually based.
Okay. Well, I still remain concerned that it's hard for us to see meaningful trend lines if we're not IPRCing. So we know that we're not saying what a student's special education need is in an IEP. So I'm concerned that we're still seeing trends go up in some of these when we know we are IPRCing significantly less children. If I look on folio 27 and I see 13,000 children only in our spec ed portfolio, no, actually that is, that's fine. Okay, my next question is, with respect to the suspensions, do we ever track year over year? And so what I mean by that is a student. So do we ever track to see if a student has had a suspension in grade 5 and grade 6 and grade 7 or grade 5 and then grade 8, grade 9? Do we ever do that kind of tracking so that we can see potentially our transitions causing issues, or what kind of information we may be able to glean from that, or potentially have we really seen a child who was suspended in grade 4, 5, and 6 and now all of a sudden no more suspensions?
So through you, Madam Chair, we don't centrally track that kind of information for individual students, though at the school level, you know, best practice would be where you have a student who's encountering multiple suspensions, admin teams and their multidisciplinary teams really do try to understand why that's happening. You're right, if suspensions are infrequent and occur, one in grade 4, one in grade 6, one in grade 8, the connections may never be made. Because of the lack of frequency. But, you know, and we do see certainly where I have anyway looked at individual students, particularly through my former Safe Schools role, who are struggling continuously with behavior. You do see some significant changes throughout their life in education, whereas they may have been really struggling with regulation for a certain period, grades 4, 5, 6, and you'll see little bumps in suspension data for different population groups, and then it changes as they move into secondary school. So there's a lot of individuality and personalization in this one, but to your main point, no, centrally we don't do this sort of longitudinal analysis or tracking of students who are suspended, but within the school where you're getting clusterings of suspensions for individual students, certainly the typical approach would be to get consent from parents and work collaboratively to try to find out what is happening that's leading to this jump in behavior.
Thank you.
Ms. Bailey?
Thanks. First of all, I'd like to say thanks very much for this report and for the approach the board has taken over the last 2 or 3 years. The bargaining unit presidents who have been representing education workers in different groups have been raising concerns about discipline and behavior and consequences, and we appreciate the fact that you're listening. There are a few things that I note about this, and one, of course, is that suspensions are only one form and not the one that we would advocate for necessarily first. There are many forms of progressive discipline, and we certainly hope that the incidents that you described that are being tracked at the school level can also be examined, because I think that some of the concerns that we hear about on a daily basis are being dealt with and can be dealt with in ways that are not necessarily linked to suspension. Having said that, going back to the feedback that you received from people in terms of the strategic action plan, one of the first things on the list for school environment was aggressive behavior. And as I look through the strategic action plan, I'm not really sure if I see some direct connections to how to approach that. And when I look at the page that says resource implications, and I'm hoping I'm misreading this, it says there are no resource implications attached to this discussion report. I'm hoping that doesn't mean that there aren't resources necessary to support the issue, because there certainly are. We need a lot of resources to support this particular issue. And prevention really is what we all, I think, need to have a look at. What are the supports these students need? Why do they need them? How can they be deployed? How can they be enriched? And so I guess I just asked the question about the meaning of that particular phrase. I'm sure I'm misreading that.
Through you, Madam Chair. So that is simply in reference to the developing of the report itself. It is a report on suspension data. It does obviously delve into some of we touch on part of the overall strategy and resources that are being put in place to support students and staff in helping teach students to better regulate and manage their behavior and reduce it. And so there's a lot of that would be and it is becoming a bigger discussion, but the resource implications is just to the developing of the report.
And so just to finish, I hope that there will be some clear links between these issues and concerns and the strategic action plan, the way that it is developed, and maybe some concrete intentional statements about those kinds of connections would be helpful. Thank you.
Trustee Penny?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just was looking at the Disproportionality Index table on Table 3 on page 28, and I just wanted to understand that a little better because I don't think it's obvious that there's no really, it looks to me like there's no real single factor, that it looks like there's multiple factors always involved when there's increased disproportionality, at least on the index number, where there's, the higher numbers are always either 2 or 3 different factors, and it seems to me that the common ones seem to be the spec ed and the low SES. And I'm just wondering if you could confirm if I'm reading that correctly. Because the situation is obviously more complex than just like it's going to obviously take a lot of complex type solutions, not very simple solutions, I don't think.
So that is our read as well, and it is the intersectionality of those pieces that we think it gets us the closest to a better understanding of and complexity is a very good word. I was reflecting with the system principal earlier. I've been an administrator in schools for a number of years now, and whereas 15 years ago, if a student swore at a staff member, for example, that might have been an automatic multiple day suspension. And right now, I don't even know if that would result in a suspension, rather more a number of interventions and conversations, and it could, but it wouldn't be automatically. If anything, is sort of our view of student behavior and the student behaviors themselves and our students themselves has become more complex. And so that was what we were trying to get at. I don't know if you're right, the higher the number, where you see the highest numbers, particularly looking at the male side of things, because there are more numbers with which to work. You'll see that low SES is often present with those highest index numbers, which does indicate a greater rate of disproportionality. I don't know if Manager Orachowski has anything to add to that. I've done a good job. Great, thank you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I just have just one other, I'm seeking to understand, just the behavior exceptionality. Would that include, well, maybe you could just tell me, like, what sort of, I know there's a number of exceptionalities that are not identified in the, by Ministry of Education, but can you enlighten me as to what sort of, exceptionalities, the non-identified ones that might be grouped into the behavior one?
So through you, Madam Chair, you're seeking clarification at how someone with a behavior exceptionality, how that might manifest and present itself, how you define it. I'm going to look to Superintendent Simmons, perhaps, to help us with that one.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have the actual definition right in front of me, but it is in our special education plan. But it would, oftentimes we see students identified with a behavior exceptionality when there's also a diagnosis of things like oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, the behavior exceptionalities that are, the behavior diagnoses that are included in the DSM, the manual that psychologists use to take a look at various disorders. So oftentimes that's the way those definitions come to be. And typically you would see them manifest themselves in the school setting with the student's inability to manage their behavior in a variety of circumstances in a variety of ways. We would be working, while an IPRC is one way to identify what the behavior is, we would be working through our multidisciplinary teams to try and figure out how to support that. And always, as always, parents are a very important part of those discussions as well.
Okay, thank you. And just one other thing, in that I am concerned that, males are hugely disproportional, like 5 times the rate of females. I'm not saying that we need to, we need to look at it, but I am somewhat concerned that that's the case. Is there something in our approach that's not right? I don't know, but I think it's worth looking at.
Trustee Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I had a question, and I may just be missing something, but in the figure 4 on page 31, looking at the infraction types, I don't see where things like drugs would fit in that. Are they slotted under other, or are they lumped in with alcohol, or where do they come in? Or do we simply not have any suspensions for those kinds of things?
Through you, Madam Chair, I would love to say yes. So these infractions, in this document, we were able to draw from those ministry infractions only. There are also a number that are in board policy that are not necessarily in ministry. You do see some, I believe, if possess alcohol were expanded, it would be possess alcohol and illegal drugs. So there'd be some suspensions captured in that, but also in the other.
But we have no way of differentiating. I guess given the ever-changing climate around drugs and substance abuse, I'm surprised that we are not either looking at all forms of substance abuse, substance misuse together, or and not having, or alternatively not having a category for each variety. So I don't know whether there's anything that can be done about that. Is there?
Dueling microphones. We do take a look at that data. We struggle in representing it here in this report. The other thing I should point out is, and I welcome a comment from the principal, simply maybe possessing or using a substance would not necessarily lead to a suspension in and of itself. It often leads to other interventions for that. It's more of an opportunity to engage a student and a parent in support. Where you do tend to get suspensions for sure is in the selling or providing or trafficking, which becomes a much smaller group of students who are engaged in that kind of behavior. So the tracking of, again, a lot of the individual student use or possession of a drug, legal or otherwise, now cannabis is legal, but illegal for students to possess, is done at the school level more so than through a suspension.
Thank you. Is Principal Anderson going to comment on that or not?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think the question that Trustee Scott brings up around the grouping together of the drug and alcohol type of infractions is what you're asking for. And as it stands, that isn't something that we have done, but perhaps that is something that through READ that we can look for doing in the future, particularly as we move into the new paradigm where we will now have ministry codes for possession of cannabis that differ from possession of alcohol, that differ from possession of illegal drugs, that there may be some value in looking at some groupings there for the next version of this report.
Thank you for that. Now, my other thing comes from the questions that Trustee Boothby was asking about Table 4 on page 30, and the number of IEP-only students who were suspended relative to those in each exceptionality, and then the proportionality of all of that in terms of the exceptionalities. And I guess what I'm wondering is whether the IPRC students who are counted here are more likely to have more intensive levels of need for support, whereas the IEP-only students as a group may have somewhat lower needs. And it stands to reason to me that if you take the lower needs kids out of a group, what you're going to have left is the higher needs kids, which may be proportionately having more suspensions. So I guess I'm just wondering, is this a filtering of people out who were perhaps not as likely to have been suspended by doing more IEPs? So that the proportions then in the IPRC categories would be higher for suspensions? I don't know whether there's an answer to that, but I'd sure appreciate if somebody'd like to take a crack at it.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, I would ask Superintendent Simmons to take a crack at it.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, through you. So the question does lead to a bit of speculation. However, our practice has been to ensure that students who are in, for example, a fully self-contained setting, a specialized program class, do have an IPRC, and we would anticipate that the students in our specialized program classes are demonstrating the need for that level of support versus other students. So it kind of gets to your question in that when we look at the IPRC kids, there are students with an IPRC, it would include the students who are receiving our Tier 3 levels of support.
I think that's something that may be worthwhile looking at whenever we start to try to analyze trends. If we have changed some of the data in some way, which would appear to be the case with the shift towards more IEPs and fewer IPRCs. If we change the data, then we can't reliably look at it year over year and say, gee, there's a trend here, because it's presenting us with false evidence. So I guess that's the concern. Thank you.
Ms. Bergaman? Trustee Campbell?
Thank you. Quick question, actually, and really just in follow-up to a question that Trustee Penny asked, and that's with respect to the behavior exceptionality. And so that I understand this, I appreciate the explanation. On folio 23 in the top, it does say dysregulated pupil behavior in the younger grades, blah, blah, blah. Inappropriate behavior can be understood as a student's way of communicating a need or responding to something in the environment. Significantly higher rates amongst boys than girls across all grades may reflect the boys more apt to communicate their dysregulation through physical modes. So when we come to the through you, Madam Chair, when we come to the behavioral exceptionality, are we effectively talking pretty much, as I understood the superintendent suggest, pretty much pure play DSM kids are effectively mental health issues with really not much in the way of unaddressed multiple exceptionalities, where the behavior exceptionality is the dominant or most noticeable one? Or so is it effectively mental health pure plays, or are we is there a risk that some of the behavior students have multiple exceptionalities that are maybe not being thoroughly addressed, and so there's an acting out? I guess that's the gist of the question.
Madam Chair, through you, that is always a risk, but I think the question really highlights the complexity of some of the behaviors that we're seeing and the increasing role that mental health is playing with some of our students and our ability to meet their needs. I'm hesitant to make broad generalizing statements on that without having all the information, but when we do look at a student with a behavior for behavior exceptionality, they may have a diagnosis of some sort in the behavior area of the DSM, but they may also have other psychological disorders at play that are presenting on the mental illness side of things. But I wouldn't be in any position to be able to say there's a trend or anything that I could identify there with any specificity or confidence.
Thank you.
Trustee Fisher?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think just to pick up on Trustee Campbell, I think it would be great to do that analysis. I think that would give us a more complete picture in terms of some of the things that might be going on in the classroom. I guess the final question or comment that I have, and I don't want to put Brian on the spot, but I will because he's here. We've obviously seen a stepped increase in terms of issues and suspensions at the elementary panel. I would certainly welcome your reflections in terms of what you're hearing from your members. I know we've got a full table here. Feel free to take a mic. I'd certainly welcome your reflections in terms of what your members are seeing. And then I guess for both you and for Kathy, after reading this report, where do you see some additional blind spots? What are we missing in this analysis? Because I keep coming back to the fact that we're in a people business. If we don't get the environment right in our classroom, our staff are not going to feel they're not going to be happy, and our students are not going to learn. It's pretty binary to me. So, in terms of what you see here, are there potential things that we're missing in terms of the what's going on in the classroom environment that we should be picking up? So,
thank you, Trustee Fisher. I would say that I agree with the previous speaker who suggested that a real key is not to deal with these at the kind of the output end of the behavior where you're having to suspend due to an extreme behavior. I think to the extent that we can put in supports and create an environment at the front end, I think that is really a key. What I hear from teachers is a growing sense of what are the policies in place at schools around progressive discipline. A very unscientific study, but one that I think is interesting to note here. At one meeting of our stewards of our 130 some odd sites, we asked stewards, how many of you are aware of what progressive discipline at your school is, and have you sat down with your administration to talk about and collaboratively come up with a progressive discipline policy at your school? Not a single steward raised their hand. I think a gap that exists is, I think, a lack of a common understanding between teachers and administrators about what is progressive discipline. And I think that any effort we can make to create mechanisms where teachers and staff sit down with administrators and say, because nobody knows these conditions at these individual schools better than the principals and the teachers who are there. I think anything that we can do to have teachers and principals sit down and talk about what does progressive discipline look at our school? If we see this behavior, what do we think some of the appropriate responses would be? What is the progression if the behaviors increase? I think those are very, very valuable discussions, and I think they have to be had more often at schools between teachers and principals.
Sorry, that's really helpful. And just to follow up on that quickly, do you know if the same conversation is or isn't happening as it relates to certain students within classrooms that are having behavioral challenges? Do you know if that conversation is happening in terms of how you manage, even a smaller number of students who might be having particular challenges?
If I understand your question, I think any good teacher as a priority, I think understands the value in creating a community within their classroom and what that looks like in terms of what kind of behavior should we expect from each other. What does respectful behavior look like?
Sorry, I meant more between the teacher and the administration. So if you've got, if you've got a student or a group of students that are constantly acting out, and let's say you're evacuating classrooms on a regular basis, is there a mechanism, is there a process where teachers are engaging with the administration in terms of what's going on here? How do we make sure that we're dealing with this, because it's clearly disruptive to the environment, which I think is a different conversation than the progressive discipline, at a school level conversation.
I hesitate to speak system-wide. I think one avenue that I've heard that works in other boards, and that I think we have the elements of here in our board, is the safe and scaring, we don't want safe and scaring schools. We want safe and caring schools. And it was was it 2012, the reporting mechanism on these incidents. What happens when these behaviors occur? They're reported on, and how are they acted on? I know in other boards there are mechanisms where if something happens, how is it reported? What is kind of the tiered approach to dealing with those? I think there's value in exploring that more widely in our board. I think a danger is when teachers see these behaviors happening and there isn't an apparent response. Maybe there is, but teachers don't see it. And I think in a lot of cases, teachers hear from administrators that there's a confidentiality piece there, which is understandable. But when a behavior happens and the response isn't clear, and what happens next, I think that can be corrosive to culture in a school.
That's a really fair point. Kathy, do you want to add anything?
I completely concur with all the things that I've just heard, and I was trying to get at the idea when I talked about incidents at the school very briefly, and the idea that this suspension is only one tiny piece of the picture, and in fact what I hear the most about from my members are incidents on an ongoing or daily basis that may not result in suspension, and perhaps shouldn't, and that isn't what we're looking for. But we are looking for, as has just been described, some clear communication, some understanding about a response, a consequence to behavior which may or may not be disciplinary, quote unquote. So all the things that you've just heard I would agree with completely at the secondary level as well.
No, through you, Madam Chair. The only thing I would add a couple different things. One piece in agreement with Brian is great communication between administration and the teachers is what makes the difference, right? We need to be working and accessing system resources together. So I couldn't agree with that more. One of the parts and the difficulties of defining what progressive discipline are, and I think Colin said it, it's not always A plus B plus C equals D. It's not at all. So when we've done and worked in the past on codes of discipline that say that when a student A does this, this shall be the result of it, it's not as clear cut as that. And teachers will be the first ones to advocate for the mitigating circumstances. I can't count the number of times I've had a teacher come and say, you know what, this is what happened, but here's what happened before and after, and this is why we need to be looking at other things to do. We know as administrators and teachers as well that a suspension in a lot of cases erodes the relationships that teachers and staff are working really hard with to develop with these kids. I guess in closing, what I would say too is behavior is communication. So when we look at mitigating circumstances, a kiddo in a classroom who can read, a kiddo who sees themselves as a learner in a classroom doesn't misbehave. Misbehavior is a communication piece, communicating a frustration. And when teachers get to know their kids, when administrators get to know their kiddos, and can get at the real keys to learning, that teaching and learning component that allows students to see themselves as learners, we see behavior going down. And that's that's huge, I think, in terms of what we need to also focus on. And that's, as to what Brian was saying, that's what comes before the behavior is the learning. Thanks.
Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I haven't heard anyone else really say this in the clear tonight, and it occurred to me that I had failed to do it as well. But I really want to express my appreciation, and I suspect everyone's appreciation, for the quality of reports on suspensions that we're seeing now. We've asked for more detail over and over again, and more analysis, and we're starting to see that, to be able to see some of the diagrams illustrating the intersectionality, to get more discussion of some of the ins and outs and whys and whereases that are attached to some of these numbers is really valuable to us in understanding better what the situation actually is, and that then will give us an opportunity to consider where we can apply different strategies, different resources, and so on over time to try to address some of the problems. So I certainly would like to say thank you very much to everybody who worked to pull this report together, because it certainly gave us, I think, probably one of the most detailed pictures we've had yet to enlarge our understanding of what we're dealing with when we talk about suspensions and expulsions. Thank you.
So that's the end of our speakers list. Let's take a break before we move on to the next report, supporting Indigenous learners at the OCDSB. We'll take a 5-minute break. I see quorum in the room. We shall continue. Can everyone take their seats? Okay, let's move on. We have report 19-059, supporting Indigenous learners at the OCDSB. I would like to call upon the director to introduce the report.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair, we have Superintendent Dorothy Baker along with Indigenous Education Vice Principal Jody Alexander, who is going to bring this report forward for us.
Good evening, and through you, Madam Chair, I'm going to start. Over the last several years, we've been bringing forward an annual report on Indigenous education, and that's come at different times of the year. This one is particularly late, and just to cue you that this is a report on the 2017-2018 year. Given that it's so late in this year, however, we have some bridging information as well, but also in anticipation of a more fulsome report coming forward in the fall of next year, which we've decided from a cyclical point of view would make sense. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the format and how it's structured, and then I'll turn it over to Vice Principal Alexander to lead some of the discussion. The context is here for you, and as you can see, it's not different from before, and it talks about the some of the ministry vision and expectations for us, and the way that we have crafted this is around the ministry goals specifically, as highlighted on folio 36, improving student well-being and achievement for Indigenous students, closing achievement gaps, and increasing public confidence. So you'll see it structured in that way. And then as we move into folio 39, some learning and next steps. So we're looking forward to the conversation around the information presented tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to Vice Principal Alexander.
Miigwech, Kweyani, Sego, Jody Alexander, Nadishnakaz, Pikwaknagan, and Dunjaba. Hello everyone, good evening. I'm Jody Alexander and I am Algonquin from Pikwaknagan. And just want to perhaps set the stage for this report in that it is much different, especially from the one we just had, that we're looking at really relationships that are being built with and among staff, students, and families. We've been working really hard as the Indigenous Education Learning Team to build those relationships and build trusting relationships, as I said, with staff, and bridging those relationships between staff and families and students. You will see highlighted in this report that we have outlined the kind of phases of understanding and knowledge that our educators have. We have some educators who are in a phase where they are they're just in the beginning stages, or the understanding and acknowledging different Indigenous knowledge and pedagogy. And then we have teachers that are working a little bit more closely, starting to implement what's the word I'm looking for? They're starting to implement, they're engaging in the learning with perspectives from the Indigenous point of view. They're engaging with history and some contemporary issues. And then the third stage that we hope that most of our teachers will be moving into is that embedding and engaging in the work on their own. Obviously, along the way, we're providing them with a lot of support. And the work that we've been doing together as a team also has been really listening to community, and that includes listening to students. And we've had many opportunities to listen very carefully to students and hopefully empower them so that they're able to help be good leaders in our system as well. And I'm very, very excited that you will be joined by Ganabao Gagne next year when he's joining as a student trustee. So, yeah, I think that's all I have, and welcome your discussion and questions. Miigwech.
Trustee Penny?
Thanks a lot, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for the report. It is very much appreciated, and congratulations on closing some of those academic gaps. I'm very pleased to see some of that, and I see that there's a little bit more work to do, especially in mathematics, but for the work that you guys have done, I'd really, really appreciate it, and I'd just like to get a feeling from Vice Principal Alexander as far as the well-being of the Indigenous students is concerned. Do you see that that well-being is something that is that students are feeling like they have they're building a good community from which they can help their well-being and their learning, and just maybe some of your thoughts on that.
Thank you for that question. We do know that statistically speaking, Indigenous students' well-being can be at risk. We think that the team that we've created is really supporting students with their mental well-being, and as there's indication in the report, we have hired a second student support and re-engagement student support coordinator, and we hope that that's going to help us as well in ensuring that students across the district will be supported however they might need to be. I also think that we are working together as a team to create the conditions that are necessary for students to feel that safe and caring environment, and ensure that when they see themselves in schools, in the classroom, that helps them with their well-being as well.
Thank you very much. It's so good to hear you say that. I think the education system in Ontario and even in Canada has got a lot to make up for to restore trust in the FNMI community, and I'm glad that we're doing our best to try to build that trusting index.
Trustee Boothby?
Thank you, and thank you for the report. It's really good to see this kind of progress. I just had a couple of questions on Folio 45, and I'm maybe going to ask you to look into a crystal ball, but I see down for grade 9 applied that is one of our gaps that is still increasing, as well as the second time OSSLT. And I'm wondering if maybe part of that trend going up, and I'm hoping that maybe some of these students that were traditionally being streamed into applied are actually now streaming into academic, and therefore perhaps the children that are remaining in applied had further ground to make up. Am I just wishful thinking, or is any insight you would have in that?
Through you, Madam Chair, thank you for that question. I don't think we have that kind of level of analysis at this point, but it's certainly a question that would be top of mind. I would see that these numbers probably reflect the trend that we're seeing across our district for grade 9 applied and previously eligible. My curiosity would be around having identified those now, what are those specific supports that we can be putting into place for those Indigenous students in that program. But to your point, the numbers are so small, as you know, of our self-identified, that makes cohort analysis problematic and challenging at times. But at the same time, with the relationships that the team is building with specific students, it gives us some leverage in how we can best support them going forward. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for that. And I suppose another part of this would be really interesting to me and maybe help us with a trend, because I don't really have a good feel for when are Indigenous students joining us. So it would be interesting to see if when children are joining us, how long does it take us to close these gaps for them? Do we have any idea what that profile looks like?
Through you, Madam Chair, Vice Principal Alexander's going to give me that one to field. I would say we're not following from when we actually have self-identification following through. That's somewhat challenging as well. Although when students do enter at the kindergarten level, that is something that is available and that we encourage. But we're finding, to be honest, that oftentimes it is about a trust. And it is about, I may be willing to self-identify or identify to someone on the team or to my teachers, but I don't necessarily want to identify on paper. So that's why the importance of building relationships and understanding how this data is being used is so important, and a huge focus for the team. And we're hoping with that and with the creation of trust and seeing how this is actually being used to support their education, we'll see more of that.
Thank you for that. And if it isn't too difficult going forward, I really would like to see how quickly we are closing gaps for these students. Because if I look at this, I mean, we're going up a little bit in grade 3. Grade 6 is probably really even, but in grade 9 applied we're going up. So I'm really curious if it isn't way too much trouble to see if we have a child that comes to us and say grade 3, are we able to make a significant close in that gap by grade 6, or is it taking us longer? And maybe that'll help us figure out what kind of strategies we need. Thanks.
Just through you, Madam Chair, there are cohort analyses that are currently being done. As you may recall, we had a disruption, and so it was difficult for the 3-6 cohort analysis to occur. But going forward, that is something that we have done, and in consultation with Reed and what kinds of data sources that we find are salient and that will make a difference in helping to program and support, that would probably be one that we would want to look at.
Thank you.
Trustee Campbell.
Thank you. A fascinating report. There's clearly a lot going on, a lot of human and other investments being made in this area, and it's great. I noted in the report, I'm always impatient to see indicators move, but I get it. The report does talk about this being fundamental work that will result down the road. It's not a direct path necessarily to improved indicators, and I appreciate that and accept that. And it's good stuff. A couple of questions, maybe one effectively following up on Trustee Boothby's questions about identification. Do we know if we have a lot more work to do in terms of encouraging identification? Do we have independent measures of population in the Ottawa area, you know, that kind of thing from other sources that we can measure our progress against and sort of estimate, okay, you know, we're not getting approximately X percent identified most likely or something like that. Do we have any sense of how much work there is to be done in terms of identification? That'd be my first question.
Through you, Madam Chair, we have looked at census data, for example, just to do a comparative as to what the percentages might be of identifying there and identifying with us. And there are inherent challenges in those as well. We have about 2% of our population identified as Indigenous at our district. We suspect it's closer to 4 or 5%. And the reason I say that is that, well, similar, the census data indicates about 2%, but we're curious about what that actually is covering. But more the point, we do have an opportunity through our Schools Climate Survey. There's an opportunity to identify there as well, and those numbers appear to be higher. So it's interesting, and trying to figure out some of those some of those indicators. We also, you know, informally in discussions with some of our community partners and what their data and their statistics tell us as well. So we're thinking that it's probably closer to 4 or 5%.
Great, that gives me a ballpark idea. So there's important work still to do that way, so I appreciate that. I really appreciate as well the full picture provided in terms of the funding and the spending and everything else. I couldn't have asked for more. It was great. I guess maybe it's too early to tell, I don't know, but do we know if the EPOs and the funding from the government is going to, in the past, is going to continue into next year yet, or there's still, we don't know one way or the other?
Through you, Madam Chair, I understand that much of the funding will continue. However, we haven't had a fulsome breakdown from the Finance Department as specifics.
And one last question, and that is, and I've wondered about this, I've long wondered about this, so this is my opportunity to ask the question. Why, in fact, the report notes that we don't currently offer native language programming or what have you, and there is a funding stream for that, that in a sense we may be missing out on. And I guess what I'm wondering is, what's the barrier to that? We do have a fair amount of Inuit immigration into the region, I believe, and there may be other groups. And indeed, obviously Ottawa being Ottawa, it's the center, I imagine, for a number of organizations. So is it the fact that other organizations provide that service and so we don't, or there are practical or logistical or other issues involved, or there's no demand? Or I guess I'd just like to understand, because we do offer heritage language classes and whatever, we have a whole arm of the board that does that. I guess I'd just like to understand that.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll start, and then I'll ask Vice Principal Alexander to continue. Well, the good news is that we are looking into this, and so our ministry regional representative has been working very hard with many of the Inuit elders in Ottawa proper, and this is a pilot. It's new. And it's a structure whereby the Elders Circle would be able to receive applications from native speakers in Inuktitut in the community, and they would be able then to recommend those people forward to the Ontario College of Teachers so that they could then be teaching. So we are looking at course credits at the secondary level, certainly, in both Inuktitut and Algonquin. And then there may be other opportunities as well, depending on the population, of how we could include that as part of an elementary programming. So there is a lot going on in the background around this. It's a huge opportunity, and it's one that we're hoping will highlight the work here in Ottawa. And I'll just add.
Thank you for that question. In addition, some of the barriers include the diversity of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, just groups within themselves. As Superintendent Baker alluded to, the qualifications.
Has joined.
The qualifications that teachers would require to teach classes are, we don't have very many people that have the qualifications, and that's the reason for the Inuit and Elders Circle. But there's also, if we were looking at this being Algonquin territory, we might want to offer Algonquin. As you said, there are a number of different First Nations in the capital region, along with Métis and Inuit. So there's those barriers, and also, just the fact that we don't have as many people that still have that language retention. So those are a couple of barriers, but we're very excited to know that, and actually just at a meeting last week, one of the Inuit elders was saying, we have a lot of elders who speak in Inuktitut, so we're very hopeful that we'll be able to provide something soon.
Yeah, exciting. Thank you very much.
Trustee Fisher?
Sorry, I just wanted you to know that Trustee Schwartz is online.
Thanks, Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a couple quick comments, and I would certainly like to echo Rob's comments about the action plan. I actually think it's a really good model template potentially for other things that we want to focus on as a board. I guess the question that I have, and I was surprised that this part wasn't actually in the action plan, is information from the previous report, which talked about the intersectionality of different cohorts. And I was struck when you look at FMI, at least in the context of suspensions, some of the numbers that exist in terms of predominantly male students, and sort of the intersectionality between F&I, low SES, spec ed. And so I'm wondering how much is that intersectionality data helping inform your strategies in terms of closing the gap when it comes to the board action plan? I didn't see that part get carried over, but I thought it was really useful information to take into account in terms of what kind of strategies are we using.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll start, and then please jump in. So we do take a look at that data and the intersectionality of all the various cohorts. The challenge, I think, from an Indigenous perspective are the low numbers, and so it's sometimes difficult to tease those out. But certainly the trends that we see and that come forward in the ASAR report as well, and some of these other reports where we are able to break that out, do help to inform some of our thinking, and bringing that forward to the Indigenous Education Advisory Council, because their mandate is to help provide some direction and input into the board action plan as well. So they are very interested in suspension rates, I would say, but more importantly, they're interested, I think, in graduation rates and in how we're supporting the students all along, but also fundamentally, how are we embedding Indigenous ways of knowing in the curriculum. I think that's been the front and foremost in their minds. And I think I will ask you to continue on that, but that's been certainly what I'm hearing from them.
And if I could just add, when we talk about achievement gaps with Indigenous students, we talk about the gap that is existent between the First Nation students and non-Indigenous students. And I think I have to go back to the achievement gap isn't within the students. It's within our system. And what are we doing to create the conditions that are going to have Indigenous students be successful? And I think that we are doing a really good job at building those relationships and creating the environment within our buildings. For example, we have many schools that are starting to look at spaces that Indigenous students might use, like the lodge. Not exactly, they're not using that template, but they are mindful of the fact that they need to create conditions that are welcoming and provide students with that sense of belonging. And when we achieve those conditions, I think we will see there is a reduction in the achievement gap as well.
Thanks, and thank you for putting a bit more time back on, because I know it was ticking away there. The second question I had is, obviously when we look at the learning conditions for our Indigenous students or any of our students, but I think particularly where there are Indigenous students, I'm just very sort of mindful of traditional ways and traditional knowledge, and so sometimes the system doesn't work for a lot of students. But are there certain techniques or approaches that we should be contemplating as a board that are sort of more in line with traditional knowledge, that are sort of maybe outside of what we would consider to be a more formalized, let's say, IPRC process or this process or that process? Are there things that we should be considering from a traditional knowledge standpoint to get at some of those underlying condition issues that are just unique, that sort of out above and beyond sort of the normal traditional process that we adopt?
I think there are definitely there's certain pedagogies around Indigenous education that I think we can be implementing. One of the barriers obviously becomes the teachers that are teaching our students and their knowledge and their understanding of implementing those pedagogies. Our team is doing some great work, especially with the last year they did the collaborative inquiry with the in partnership with the Ottawa Inuit Children's Centre, now called Inukatiki. So they were doing some exploration on how can we support Inuit students coming from the Children's Center and into our schools, and they had some strategies that they could implement, and I think there really are tangible strategies that we can offer. The challenge becomes how do we get to all of the teachers and work in a meaningful way. We know that this year we had difficulty with occasional teachers, and that meant not pulling out a large group of teachers necessarily to work with. But I think that actually was a blessing in disguise, because then we were able to work specifically with smaller groups of teachers and have it be real meaningful learning for the teachers. And I think that the continued work of the Indigenous itinerant coach is also really valuable, because she works alongside with teachers in classrooms where, that she's not only assisting in the planning and providing teachers with help bringing in perspectives, history, and contemporary issues, but she's also having meaningful conversations about assessment. So I think that, we're, as a system, we're looking for best ways to help teachers. I think we have them. The challenge being, how do we get them to everyone?
That's a fair point. And I think just one last comment to close. I think whether it's our Indigenous elders, our knowledge leaders, or the Indigenous Education Advisory Council, and I think this might be true for a lot of our committees, I think we as a board should find some opportunities within our calendar to actually sit down with some of our groups and, outside of a formal setting, and actually try and have a dialogue and a conversation and interact, about some of the issues that we care about, whether it's our First Nations, Métis, Inuit students, and how we're supporting them, whether it's, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think there's merit in thinking about how we create a place for those relationships and those dialogues to occur at this level of the system, because I know there's a lot going on at a variety of levels, but not necessarily the engagement and the relationships at this level. I don't know how we do that as a board, and we've got a busy schedule, but I think it would be a benefit to us as a board of trustees to create that space and that trust and those relationships and that understanding, and it's two-way. And so I think that's just a last point I would make to the board for consideration.
Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, and thank you to the Superintendent and Vice Principal for the report. I'm just going to pick up on a bit of what Trustee Fisher was talking about. I had the pleasure of attending one of the Indigenous Education Advisory Committee meetings, and I found that quite helpful. And what struck me about it is there was a few students there, and as somebody who attends a lot of our committees, it's rare for me to see students, except perhaps at this table, but and I was very impressed, and I actually thought, boy, there was one particular student there, I thought, this person's really going to go places. But picking up on the notion of trust, and to what Trustee Fisher was talking about, is there a role for the board to develop that trust in the relationship? I know after the meeting, I did it in the parking lot with a couple of people and was there for a bit, but is there maybe more formal than a parking lot, but less formal than this table? Is there a middle road? Oh.
I think there is opportunity, and just depending on where we want to go. I know that Superintendent Baker and I also spoke about who are some people that maybe we could bring in and have work with the trustees, work with senior staff, work with principals. There's a number of people in the Ottawa area and nationally that we certainly would be able to ask if they would be willing to come and participate with us. And there is always opportunity to do things within the city. I have a little newsletter that I share with principals that talks about what's going on with different organizations like Wabano, like OICC, and certainly the invitation's open and usually open to the public to do that knowledge building.
Thank you for that, and through you, Madam Chair, and thank you for mentioning that, because I find I've often said when I'm in a group, you know, I go to a lot of events, but if I don't know about them, I don't go because I don't get invited. So if maybe there's a chain of emails that perhaps the trustees could be on, that would be great. And one final question, Madam Chair, through you, and I know the CFO has left, so perhaps this could be directed to the director, and I appreciate if you perhaps can't answer it, but I notice in Appendix C here, there is a substantial amount of money, of resources that's going in to support these learners. Do we have any indication if this funding is in jeopardy at all, or will it just continue?
Through you, Madam Chair. So while it is that I can't answer the question in explicit to the penny kind of response, one of the things that we have been signaled through the government is that there's a continued commitment to Indigenous learning. So how it is that the funds are being broken out, I can't comment on that at this point, but I'm pretty confident in saying that we will continue to be supported for this work.
Thank you.
Trustee Ellis?
On page 48, I'm trying to get a handle on the finances here. Just at the bottom, we see the budget and then the expenditures, and there's a note under there that we were unable to spend the full amount. Will we be able to carry that over, or is that money going to be clawed back?
Through you, Madam Chair, we were able to carry forward some of that, specifically for the one for support for implementation of the revised curriculum. So that did come forward this year and was sent out to schools, and that will be part of the follow-up report for next year.
About $100,000, $120,000? The difference between the total operating and plus EPO, and that, which is 1,538,431, and then the expenditures of 1,400,000. Okay. So we get specific funding from the province of the total operating plus the EPO?
Through you, Madam Chair, if I understand your question, this is both together, yes. The operating and then the EPOs as well are included.
Okay. And the board action plan is $130,000. Those funds, was that an EPO that funded the board action plan? Or where does that $130,000 for the board action plan come from in grants from the province?
Through you, Madam Chair, there's $130,000 that came through the GSN, and then there were additional funds from an EPO that were included to support the board action plan as well.
Okay, I'm still not sure where the 130 is coming from. Let's look on page 47. Native study. If you could just explain each of those fundings, that would be helpful.
So the funding's under the operating budget here. There is funding for a full-time vice principal. The Native Studies sections 3.
Sorry, I didn't make myself clearly. On page 47, under the Indigenous supplemental grant, there's Native Studies for $500,000 per pupil amount, and then the board action plan. It seems to be there might be some crossover, and I understand why that might be. I'm just trying to understand where the money comes from and an explanation as to whether that's, I'm assuming that the funds, the revenue coming from the province is sweatered for First Nations, Métis and Inuit program delivery, if you can confirm that as well.
Through you, Madam Chair, these monies are intended to be used for Indigenous education and are. There are some funds, though, however, for example, through the compulsory NBE English courses, my understanding is that those are not sweatered funds, and so I'll defer to Superintendent Carson or CFO Carson to elaborate a little bit more on that, and that will certainly, that's part of our reporting out for the report for next year on this year.
Now I'll move away from the finances. I've had the good opportunity to be active at Rideau, where a lot of this started. One of the exciting things I saw there, Rideau being a smaller school, the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit population as a percentage was a little higher than I think is now. And there was some of that, we have the safe space, the lodges for the students, but some of that, the lodge and the culture was starting to imbue the wider school in a positive way. And I know that's being, trying to be emulated at Gloucester. Could I guess, sort of an update on, not just at Gloucester, but across the board, how we're taking that safe space for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and extending it out into the hallways and the classrooms as well.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll start and then I'll pass it over to my colleague. What I would say is that you're talking, I think, about the environment in the third teacher and how do we spread and make a place of belonging in the entire school. I would say that that there's very much well, how can I say this? Rideau was a situation that was unique to our district, and moving into the Gloucester, pulling those two schools together, we saw that Indigenous safe space co-created with the students occur. And a lot of great work has gone into supporting students at that school. What I would say is that what we're hearing loud and clearly is that for the district to be considering the 4 directions, that there are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students in all of our schools, that it's important that we consider spaces in our schools for all of our students, and they don't need to look like the lodge at Gloucester. That it just recognizing that there's a safe space that they may go, that we have protocols in place for smudging, for example, that we are building that capacity in our teachers and educators, and with partnerships with students and with community, are creating those schools where the minute you walk in the front door, you know. And so I think that that's the good work that the team is continuing to do with the help of the students. I will say that their leadership has been incredible, and they're the ones that want to reach out and continue to do this work in making sure that all of our schools are places of belonging for them. And I'll just let Jody continue.
And certainly I can say that based on the number of reach outs to me and to the team for support have been plentiful. There's a number of schools that are doing really great work, and as Superintendent Baker alluded, there are places that they're not necessarily recreating a lodge, but they are creating a space for students to come and ensure that they are in a safe space. And there's a number of champions within the district that are making sure that it's not just staying within that small space, but it's going out into the schools. And I would say one of the challenges for us is, you know, as you mentioned, Rideau was a place where we thought that many of the Indigenous students went to school, and the concern I always have is, what about the student who is in another part of the board that doesn't have that same support? And I think that with the teams, the team and the staff wanting to do a good job, you know, with the TRC report that's out, and the social studies curriculum that was implemented in the fall of this year. You know, there's a lot of people that are wanting to do a good job and make sure that our schools are welcoming for Indigenous students. So I think that we're getting there.
Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate what is in this report, and I'm really looking forward to the next one. But I guess the one question I have, and this is purely qualitative and speculative in terms of the answer that can probably be given. But we've talked a lot about what we're doing with our teachers and so on, and making the schools a welcoming place for our Indigenous students. There are a lot more students in the schools than there are teachers. And I guess the piece that we're not talking about very much here is what the impact has been on the other students in terms of their not accepting our Indigenous students for who they are, but appreciating and understanding our Indigenous students for who they are. And whether or not that is moving in a good direction, and do we have any way of assessing how well we're doing with it?
Sorry, through you, Madam Chair, I just, as a principal in a school right now, and a school that is very much sort of at the beginning of that journey, I appreciate the chance to comment on that. We are noticing a difference. We started, it's only been in the last year and a half that we've really started our journey at my school, and last spring we had a smudge at our heads meeting, our full day heads meeting. And just as a casual, you know, how many of you have done this before? 2 of us had ever participated in a smudge. Nobody had, they knew of it, but nobody had really been exposed to it. So this is our leadership team in the school, and even we as leaders had not been exposed to it. So we started there. We've had PD for staff, as you said, but the teachers can learn everything. Where does it go after? What was really fascinating to me is the way Jody and Nancy Henry and the team at the board level has shared their knowledge with staff. It is in a way that is so emotionally impactful that teachers come in thinking, yeah, okay, it's another PD session, but they leave with an emotional connection to it that really after that, they take it to the classroom. They're ready to run to the class to do the next thing. What can we do? How can we move this reconciliation further? How can we move our knowledge, but then more importantly, the students' knowledge further? We've had biology classes who did projects on flora and fauna that had to have native plants and an Indigenous meaning behind them, and what was, so they're looking at it in science, they're looking at it in chemistry. They're looking at, like, why do we use these certain elements in smudging? We've looked at it, of course, in the social science curriculum because it's a natural, very obvious connection, but then we are not a school who is piloting the NBE course, the English, Indigenous Studies, Literature course. But my staff said, no, but we're not ready for that yet, but we really want to make sure we include some novels in every grade. So already they've started doing that. And every step of the way, and it was a big conversation we had as a staff, it can't be just about, and excuse me if I'm being in any way offensive, but it can't just be about feeling sorry for or looking at all the negative impacts of history. And it's got to be about the celebrating. It's got to be about valuing the Indigenous offerings of, and their teachings over time and their history. So it's been really neat to see it in a positive light. We've just started, and I see it in so many different little pockets. We're not even close to there yet. We don't have a lodge. We're not there yet, but we did offer the Indigenous, the arts course, the NAC course last year. With a small population, we can't do it every year. But we did offer that, and kids were really excited. They've done beading in some of their classes. So it's one of the things I have to say, Paula Reynolds Hall is my vice principal, and having somebody with an Indigenous background in the school really does make a powerful impact, and it's a powerful statement to our students when they are reflected in the staff. So that too has definitely had an impact. But it's been an exciting year because I've seen them focusing on the positives too, and there's more conversation around it. We also had, I think it was Nancy who came in and did the blanket exercise with a couple of our social studies classes. Anyway, very exciting to see it moving forward and for students to actually be impacted by it.
And if I could speculate, I think that it's really exciting to see and hear from a principal who sees it in the building. It's also exciting to be moving beyond the social studies curriculum and seeing it into different areas of the curriculum. But I know that students are asking they're driving what's being taught in the schools. We have had some feedback from the second phase of the NBE, the English courses, and I spoke to a teacher, I want to say it was maybe in January or February, and he indicated that he's never taught the course before, but he said this course and teaching it to the students, and they're not all Indigenous students, obviously. He said it's the most engaged I've ever seen my students in the classroom, because they are learning so much more and learning about the real history of Canada, and celebrating as well some of the great things, not always dwelling on the things that are traumatic. And the Indigenous Youth Symposium, we just had our third symposium this year, and again we invited Indigenous students to bring a friend, and we had responses from some of the students there as well that are very appreciative that they're able to learn with the friend that they came with about their culture. So a little speculative, but I think it's going well.
I'm delighted to hear that, and especially from direct observation of what's happening. I didn't say we needed numbers and data, but certainly I think you've got a pretty good sense of how things are going, and it's important for us to have that understanding too. A couple of years ago, as I recall, we had a set of information that gave us a sense of where the distribution of our Indigenous students who have self-identified across our schools. Has there been very much change in the overall pattern in the last couple of years? And at some point in time, maybe with the fall report, would it be possible to provide us a little information on the distribution?
Through you, Madam Chair, and Vice Principal can jump in at any time. So one of the trends that we began to see a couple of years ago was an increase in the population in the West End. And certainly even with our Indigenous Education Advisory Council, some commentary around the fact, can we do one in the East, one in the West, and flip them so that people can come? But I believe we had provided aggregated data to trustees 2 years ago in a memo format, and we can certainly do that, provide that again.
That would be much appreciated. Probably no need for an immediate rush for it for this instant, but perhaps sometime in the fall would be great.
Trustee Ellis.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up a little more on sort of some of the cultural and worldview differences. It was mentioned that there are students at the Indigenous Education Advisory Council, and one of the reasons is because that group, when we were putting together their terms of reference, insisted that students be part of it. Not that different than our worldview. We want to include students as well. But I'm wondering if I can get a comment. I know in working and attending some of those meetings, there was some, it took a while for that group and us, the board, to come to terms with the way we do things and the way that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit do things. And I've since learned from going to that within that group, of course, their traditions are different as well. So there's quite a bit of learning going on within the IAC group and the board. And I'm wondering if I can just get a comment on how that non-Eurocentric worldview and the different worldviews there are working through these things. And when I say moving it out of the lodge or whatever, is seeing that different non-Eurocentric take on things. And I know this is a long term, what I'm asking, but how we might be progressing and trying to, and perhaps breaking down, it's not really the right words, breaking down barriers, but seeing that cross-pollination at work to make all of our understandings more nuanced and rich. Sorry, that's a tough question.
Yes, that's a very difficult question. But I think that I was thinking back to the question from Trustee Fisher earlier about the different pedagogies and how can we ensure that the system that our students are in, and in the case that you're speaking to IAC, how are we breaking down some of those structures? So I think about just the physical space that and how we were sitting together at IAC. We were in a circle, and that was one of the pedagogical assessment tools, if you will, that I was thinking of, where we sit together in circles, shoulder to shoulder, together in the work, where there's no hierarchy, where we're all equals and learning with and from each other. So I think that if we can somehow bring that that notion into the system that we have Indigenous students and families learning and working in, that would be extremely helpful for some of the students that we have and families. Just thinking about, I have a friend who had a really horrible experience with school, and she was bullied all of her school years because she was Indigenous, and most of the students were non-Indigenous in the building. And when we invited her back to do some work in the school with students beading and learning what math lies in this loom beading, she had to have a walk through the school because it was a place of trauma. So I think understanding that sometimes unintentionally these places, these schools, these institutions are places of trauma. How can we make them more inviting? I don't know if that at all answers your question, but I hope that it answered a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Ms. Bergamin, did you have another? So that's the end of our speakers list. I'd like to thank the director and staff for the reports. We're moving on to information items. Report 9.1 report from OPSPA. Would like to call upon Trustee Boothby or Penny for an update.
No update this evening, Madam Chair.
9.2 new ministry initiatives. I'd like to call upon the director for any new initiatives.
No new initiatives today.
And finally, 9.3 OSTA update. Trustee Scott.
This is with reference to the ministry initiatives, Madam Chair, and that is just to note that the revised Indigenous education curriculum was released this afternoon by the Ministry of Education. There are still, I believe, possible further changes, but a link to that was sent out this afternoon, which I have shared with relevant senior staff and trustees.
Thank you, Trustee Scott. Do you have an update for OSTA?
No, I don't.
And item number 10, long-range agendas on folio 49. Are there any discussions or questions regarding the long-range agendas? Trustee Boothby?
Thank you. I'll just ask one hopeful question. Capital Priorities 2019 was removed from tonight's agenda, and I don't see it anywhere. Is that a bad sign?
There is a new issue, so it has been adjusted.
So that's not a subtle signal that we don't expect the province anytime soon to ask for capital priorities? That's my question.
Through you, Chair, we will review that, and it is something that will be upcoming.
Thank you.
Any new business? Trustee Campbell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I don't know if anybody can answer, or maybe someone can get back to me on this. I noticed in a news item today, or maybe in the last day or two, I'm not quite sure, the minister was reacting to, I gather, certain statements from the Peel Board, and mentioned governance reviews of boards, specifically in this case of Peel, but that coming down, that in the future, that there was going to be, she seemed to allude in the news item at least to some future process that would conduct governance reviews around school boards. So maybe I'm out of the loop on this, and I should have been aware, or I'm not, and this is well known. Is there something that we know of that's planned, that's coming from the province that is going to review the governance of school boards?
At this point, no, I don't have information on that particular item, but as you are aware, this is an ever-changing landscape, so it's certainly something that we can investigate and return to trustees with a response.
Any other questions? I see none. I declare the meeting adjourned.
As left.